That I broke another glass ceiling. It hurt my head a little bit. But I kept thinking about the responsibility that I had for the women that would follow me. Because if I wasn't there to break that glass ceiling, would it be broken for them? Or would they continue to struggle to be able to make a name for themselves as professional officers that happened to be female? So I knew that with this kind of visibility, that could work for me or against me, and it was up to me. Because when you're the only female officer in your unit, and in fact had to camp with the nurses unit down the road because they didn't know what to do with you, when you're the only female in a whole meeting of males, you are noticed. And I decided I was going to make that work for me rather than against me. I would be able to stand out. And I knew, again, that this was not just my reputation hinging on it, but it was the reputation of all women, because we tend to get categorized, stereotyped. And there were some women in the military that did hurt the rest of us because they used their femininity to get advanced to the next rank. And so it was really a little bit of a balance, because you want to be a professional soldier, but still, you're a woman. You don't want to give that up. You want to fit in with the group, but you don't want to get too familiar, because there's perceptions to worry about. And it was really kind of a fine line where my male counterparts, they were part of the gang and they always had a good time and didn't have to worry about things like how much they drank or what they may have said or how late they stayed out. But as a woman, there's a reputation and there's rumors and there's speculation. So always tried very hard to, number one, not just do what was expected of me, but to do more than that, to excel, to make sure that I was always professional and that the women behind me would be able to follow in my footsteps and do it proudly. Well, Hillary mentioned that I served in Afghanistan. I was there for about 11 months. And there I served as the head of secretariat for the International Police Coordination Board. Pretty long title. It's hard to fit it all on a business card, but I did. And as such, I had to travel around the country quite a bit. I mostly traveled with the Europeans. So basically, every day I would walk off the base there at Camp Eggers by myself, and I would wait outside the gate for the Europeans to come pick me up in the morning. Europeans had different rules than we did. They could drink at night, and God love them, they did. And they had a great time, but I could not count on them picking me up on time. So here I am, and I'd been told by the Afghans that I was a triple target. I'm a female, I'm an American, I'm a colonel. So waiting outside the gate itself is being manned by Afghan police. And I'm there by myself, waiting and waiting and waiting. So I asked the general officer in charge, commanding general, I said, I would like permission to drive myself.
In 67.
I'm sorry.
When I was in Vietnam,
Hang on.
that
Don't lean on that. Anyway, so I asked for exception to policy, 2 exceptions to policy. The policy was that you always had to travel in more than one vehicle, and there had to be at least 2 people in each vehicle. Well, if I had to rely on Americans to take me to the base where the Europeans were, that meant that I would tie up 4 American soldiers and 2 vehicles just to take me back and forth to work. I wasn't going to put them in jeopardy. So I asked for permission to drive by myself in a vehicle by myself outside the wire every day. Absolutely not. It was turned down. I begged my case, pleaded my case, turned down. Well, we got a new commanding general, and so I pleaded my case again, and he approved it. So every day, I loaded up all by myself and headed outside the wire. So in addition to all of my gear, and I'm not a real big woman, but my gear itself weighed around 40 pounds. But since I was traveling by myself, I also had to carry my combat lifesaver bag, which is full of IVs, and so it's pretty heavy as well. And then my briefcase with all my work. So I'm headed out, and somebody had taken a picture of me, which I sent to my husband, and it made him cry when he saw his little soldier weighted down. But so for the most part, as I traveled around the country, I was the only American, I was the only female, and I was the only military. I was traveling about with police from the international community, mostly Europeans, but basically 39 countries. And our job was to make sure that training for the Afghans was standardized. If you can imagine 39 countries trying to help Afghanistan, but they're donating all these different uniforms. So uniforms from China, from Russia, from Iran. You think that might be a little confusing to the citizens of Afghanistan trying to figure out who the police are? Donating weapons of every kind, vehicles of all different kinds, and then the training itself. So if you can imagine the training style, training standards for a Chinese policeman might be a little bit different than that of Canada. And so trying to get all of these countries to standardize everything from equipment to procedures for the Afghans, that was our job. Challenging, absolutely. Not to mention that the Afghans had only about a 30% literacy rate at that time. So trying to train people that cannot read and write is extremely difficult at best. So I spent a couple nights on the Pakistan border with the border police. And the interesting thing about the Afghans is that their first loyalty is to the tribe. The tribe may and does cross country borders. Second loyalty is to the family. Third is to the country. So if you are a border policeman, and you're making $70 a month, and you have 14 children at home to feed, how tempting do you think it might be to accept a bribe from somebody that wants to cross the border, or from somebody that wants to get information? How difficult do you think that would really be? So I will tell you that corruption existed at every level, all the way from the police up to some of the ministers, like Minister of Defense, Minister of Police. So all in all, it made everything very challenging. We also tried to introduce to them what right should look like for females serving in their police force. 0.5% of their police force were women. And basically, they hired women on their police force because they have very strict rules in their culture. And the blue burqas that the Afghan women wore could hide an awful lot of explosives. So they wanted women on the police force so they could check, pat them down or check, make sure that there were not explosives underneath. But they didn't want to use these women for real police duties. They really only wanted to use them if they had to for a search. So day to day, the police women would just clean the police stations, and they would cook meals for the police officers. That's how they were used. So we held an Islamic police women's conference and invited women from 19 different Islamic countries, and to help show what right looked like, how police women could and should be used. And it was a real eye-opener for them. And I attended one of the very first graduations for the women police there. It was a very small squad, but it was still something to celebrate. Well, shortly after I returned from Afghanistan, and keep in mind, my husband's a Vietnam veteran, he worried every minute that I was gone. I could not have done what I did in deployment without the support of my husband. He took care of literally everything at home, to include taking care of my mother, moving her into a nursing home, buying her Depends diapers, holding her hand after she had her breast cancer surgery, also that I could focus on my mission. And that's what military families do. They take care of everything at home because we cannot afford to be distracted. So I finally make it home, and my husband Ernie is beside himself, relieved. And then we get word that our son Sam and his wife Billie Jean were to deploy to Iraq together, both helicopter pilots for the Tennessee Army National Guard. Sam was an instructor pilot, very proficient at several aircraft, and he actually came home a little bit early to learn a new aircraft that the National Guard was receiving. Billie Jean was quickly excelling with her pilot skills. She was slotted to be the very first female instructor pilot for the Tennessee National Guard. Instead, she made another first. She was the first female casualty of the Tennessee Army National Guard. And on February 21st, 2010, Chief Warrant Officer 2, Billie Jean Grinder, gave her life in service to our country while serving in Iraq when her helicopter went down. Billie Jean loved the military. Her parents were both working on the flight line in Smyrna, and she would go out to the flight line every day and see them. That was her dream. She was living her dream. And I will guarantee you, if Billie Jean knew her fate, she would have still gone and served. So very, very proud of Billie Jean, and know that while I stood on the shoulders of other women that served before me, there are others that were looking at people like me and Billie Jean to pave the path for them. And my husband will tell you, I'm very independent, always have been. That is in my gene pool as well. But it might surprise you to know that women have served in every war since the Revolutionary War. I don't know if you've heard of Molly Pitcher, but Molly Pitcher was a nickname they gave her because she supposedly was carrying water to some of the soldiers, which included her husband. When her husband was shot and killed, she picked up the firearm and she stood in his place. There are women that served in the Confederate Army as well as the Union Army. And they would disguise themselves as men so that they could fight. And of course, you've heard about General Foote's story, but it was really General George Marshall, and at the urging of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, he was also very impressed by the British use of women in the military. And that's when he decided that he needed to open something up to women in the military. So back in 1942, you heard about the Women's Army Corps, the WACs. It actually started as the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, and then it was upgraded to the WACs. They had full military status. The WACs worked in 200 non-combatant jobs and in every theater of the war. By 1945, there was 100,000 WACs and 6,000 female officers. In the Navy, they had their version. It was the Women Accepted for Voluntary Emergency Services, or the WAVES, and they had the same status as Naval Reservists, and they provided support in the United States. The Coast Guard's Women Reserve is called the SPARS. That's after the Coast Guard motto, Semper Paratus, always ready, SPARS. We love acronyms. And the Marine Corps Women's Reserve also followed suit. But there was another group that you may not have heard of, and that is by the WASPs. That is Women's Air Force Service Pilots. Now, these women were already licensed and certified as pilots before they joined the WASP. And they were the very first women to fly military aircraft. They flew the aircraft from the factories to the bases. They delivered them to the training areas. They delivered cargo. And for their training missions, they were targets. They were targets. And they did that so that we could free up the military pilots to do more things directly related with their combat mission. So these women pilots were able to support in other ways so that the men would be available for their service. But more than 1,000 WASPs served, and 38 of them gave their lives in service to country during that time. However, unlike the other groups, they were not given military status. They were considered civil service employees. And for those fallen WASPs, they were not given military funeral honors. They were not given benefits. They were not recognized as military members. It wasn't until 1977 that these women were given veteran status and able to get veterans benefits and care at VA facilities. Think about it. World War II to 1977. They waited decades. Recently, those WASPs that are still alive received a Congressional Gold Medal, and most of these women are around 90 years old, but there were several that were over 100 years old, and they were recounting their service with the WASP. So some of these women in uniform took clerical jobs, medical jobs. They drove trucks. I met this delightful female Marine that drove trucks during the World War II, shorter than me. When I drove 5-ton trucks when I was in transportation, I had to stand up every time I had to shift gears. She was smaller than me. So she told me that she made herself a booster seat, and she created blocks to put on the pedals so that she could drive these trucks back and forth to California. Women were also lab technicians. They rigged parachutes. They were radio operators. They analyzed photographs. They worked in Intel. I met another delightful woman veteran who told me on her 100th birthday that she was part of the Manhattan Project. And when she went to go serve, she could not tell her family where she was going. She just said, "I'll see you when we're done." So women have done a lot in the military and for the military. In the Army Nurse Corps, a lot of those women were very close or on the combat zone. There were 16 women that were killed as a result of enemy fire. in World War II. 68 were captured as POWs in the Philippines. More than 1,600 nurses were decorated for bravery, and 565 WACs in the Pacific earned awards for their service. When the Korean War started, there were 22,000 women in service, and about 7,000 of those were healthcare professionals, so about a third. In Vietnam, over 7,000 served in Vietnam. They really don't know for sure how many were serving other than Vietnam. Right now, about 15% active duty serving are female, and about 18% in the National Guard and Reserves are women. Since the Korean War, there's been no real front lines and rear area. So women are in the hostile battle space, and they are engaging in direct combat. You heard mention of the Silver Star recipients in the film. Staff Sergeant Leanne Hester, military police for the Tennessee Army National Guard, is one of those recipients. She was the first one since World War II to receive a Silver Star, and the very first to receive Silver Star for valor in close combat operations. Leanne Hester's a real hero. She was with the Kentucky National Guard when she received her Silver Star, and she just returned from another deployment to Afghanistan. An amazing woman, very humble. For the first time in U.S. history, 2 females have graduated from Ranger School. The course is so grueling that even a lot of the men don't make it. So Captain Kristen Grease and Lieutenant Shay Haver, both West Point graduates, recently graduated from Ranger School, and their counterparts said that they not only carried their own weight, but they carried more than that. During one of the exercises, one of the male lieutenants was very tired after carrying the M240 machine gun, weighs 17 pounds. And he went down the line asking each member of the squad, would you please carry the machine gun? They were all equally as tired, and each one of them refused. The next person in line was Captain Greased, and she excitedly took the machine gun, and she carried it the rest of the way. Another one of the females carried the radio. We're talking, not radio with a big antenna that makes you a great target. She carried that. The next day, those 2 women swapped, and so they were both still carrying that extra load. So those 2 women are not eligible to join the 75th Ranger Regiment, which is very elite, but it is still closed to females. But more and more combat positions are coming open to women. Female POWs during World War II were really treated a lot better than the men. Their jobs consisted of picking bugs out of the food and helping to clean up the camp. But now that women are in combat roles, it's assumed that they would not be treated as well as those World War II POWs. This seems to bother the public more than it does those in the military, as evidenced by poll responses taken by the U.S. Air Force Academy. But again, don't feel that that is reason enough to keep them from filling positions that they serve in so very well. Women are serving their country proudly and with honor. The veteran community is seeing a big growth in female veterans. Right now, female veterans are about 10%, but because there's 15% now, that will be growing. Here in Tennessee, we've got 45,000 women veterans. 68% of them are combat veterans. In OIF-OEF, 11.6% of the forces were women, and double that of Vietnam and Desert Storm combined. Over 150 women have given their lives during the global war on terror, to include my daughter-in-law, Billie Jean. 40% have children. It is harder to identify women veterans because we don't wear the caps, the T-shirts, have the tattoos. we don't join veteran service organizations at the same rate that men do. So it may be harder for women to receive support that others would receive from a veteran service organization. The top 3 reasons that women receive VA health care: PTSD, hypertension, and depression. The average age of women veterans is 48 years old compared to 63 years old for their male counterparts. 21% of American homeless OIF veterans are women. That's about double the ratio of those that are serving. There's roughly about 7,000 homeless women veterans living in the United States today, according to the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. And they expect this to increase as more and more women return home from Iraq and Afghanistan, where women are serving on the front lines and experiencing other problems. So, ladies and gentlemen, not everyone can serve in the military. Not everyone should. But everyone can support those that are serving and those that have served. And just don't forget that women are veterans too. So this concludes my presentation, and I think we have time for some questions. Anybody?
Thank you, Commissioner Grinder. We do have some time for questions, so I would encourage you to ask them.
Yes, sir.
I wanted to ask you, given your own experiences in Afghanistan and based on your brother's experiences in Vietnam, I wanted to ask you, as far as you can perceive, what similarities and differences are there between the Vietnam War and the Afghan War, and what lessons do you think we learned between Vietnam and Afghanistan, and what mistakes do you think we repeated?
Good question. First of all, we have our Vietnam veterans to thank for many, many things. One is the awareness of welcoming and honoring returning veterans rather than calling them names and throwing things at them. But those Vietnam veterans also fought very hard for legislation, for increased services at the VA. When our Vietnam veterans came home, their transition existed of getting off the airplane, being warned, might not want to wear your uniform downtown, shaking their hand, good luck. That was it. The screening process that we receive now is very intensive. It starts before we ever leave service. It continues again after we return to the States, then 60 days after, then 180 days after. And screening for medical problems and for PTSD. In Vietnam, I think the blinders were on. Yeah, you've been to war, but you're home now. You're going to be okay. We found out that was not the truth. And so it was because of Vietnam that really a lot of these doors were opened. We also learned an awful lot about medical care on the battlefield. If you wait to transport them, they're not going to survive. As a result of the protective gear that we have now, of the immediate medical aid that's provided on the spot, and everything else, now we have people that are surviving things that would have killed them in Vietnam. But we also have a lot more veterans with catastrophic injuries as a result.
Other questions? Yes.
I've got a question that might be able to be answered better by one of the MTSU faculty, but I was wondering, last week or 2 weeks ago, we heard 4.4% of MTSU students are veterans. I was wondering how big of a female veteran population we have here on campus.
You know,
I can get that for you. We have a.
I was just curious because of some of the numbers she was
Sure.
saying. I was wondering what compared to the national average we have on campus.
That's a great, Colin, correct?
Yes.
I have that ability to get that for you, and that'd be good.
Sounds good.
No, certainly it's substantially less, and we'll find out.
And I know MTSU is really leading the state as far as collecting data on student veterans and in fact sharing that with other institutions. So I'm sure they'll be able
It's
to.
on my desktop. The little, shortcuts right there.
Question in the back, Sarah.
Yeah. So you were talking about as a woman leader in the military, you kind of have to repair the reputation of leaders that have come before you that might not have been as moral, I should say, or however you want to put it. How much of a struggle do you think that still is for women that are coming up after you?
Well, I will say that, there's human beings in every element. But because women aren't as new to the military anymore, I know that our male counterparts count on us. They need us to fill the role in the units. And so a lot of that's just not going to be tolerated as much anymore. But again, the human factor is there. And but promotion systems have changed now. So while they may be able to survive in the military as far as getting promoted, it's not going to be as easy as it was then. I'm sure it could still happen, but I don't think to the extent that it was.
Other questions?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Given that our combat mission in Afghanistan has been winding down, what's your outlook on the future of that country? Do you think the Afghan people and police and military are up to the task?
Ooh. You might want to attend General Huber's presentation tonight at Belmont. But I will tell you, there's some real challenges in Afghanistan. For one thing, we have our great idea of democracy and how government should work. And keep in mind, Afghanistan has been embattled from its inception.
Mm-hmm.
And do they really know what right looks like? And we try very hard as Westerners to say, this is the way you should be. And the way we are is wonderful for us. I'm just not sure that the Afghans may be ready to change all of their ways. Now, under Taliban rule, when women were not allowed to go to school, where most of the teachers were women and they were not allowed to teach. So again, some of these were some things that created the problem with literacy. And they did not want their citizens to be informed. So there was no television, no newspapers. They were purposely kept in the dark. So as far as what is the future for them, can they handle it? The literacy problem is going to continue to plague them. The corruption problem will continue to plague them. That's been their accepted way of life for so long that even though we are working so hard to try to bring them up to our way of living, is something that they've never experienced. So it's hard for them to really picture it in their mind and to do what it's going to take to sustain that.
I think we'll conclude with that comment. Please join me again in thanking Commissioner Grinder.